Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Jessica Lorai, and I'm the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Our mission is to invite people from diverse secular, spiritual, and religious traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and friendship. We seek to unify people around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. And tonight we have a special guest. His name is Philip Goldberg. Philip has been studying the world's spiritual traditions for more than 50 years as a practitioner, teacher, and writer. A meditation teacher, spiritual counselor, and ordained interfaith minister, he has lectured and conducted workshops in a variety of venues in North America and in India. His articles have appeared in numerous publications, and he's the author or co-author of 25 books, including the award-winning American Veda, From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, The Life of Yogananda, the story of the yogi who became the first modern guru, and his latest release, Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, Powerful Tools to Cultivate Calm, Clarity, and Courage. He blogs on Elephant Journal and Spirituality and Health, co-hosts the popular Spirit Matters podcast, and leads American Veda tours to India. So welcome, Philip. I'm going to be turning it over to you in just a moment, and Philip's going to be talking about remaking the borders of spirit, rethinking, reimagining, and revising how we view religion. So again, welcome, Philip, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Nice to be with all of you. I want to thank Jessica for inviting me, and I'm actually very excited to talk about this today. Over the years, I've noticed that, to my pleasure, the interfaith world has become more and more inclusive, reflecting the real diversity of America's religious and spiritual landscape. And it's also gotten deeper. And Jessica just alluded to that, by which I mean, at least in some interfaith venues, it recognizes the central importance of spiritual practice and spiritual experience. So people are sharing their methodologies, not just their beliefs and dogmas. These are very good signs, but I think there are still many barriers to break down and more harmony and unity to be achieved. And one way I think that can be facilitated is by rethinking the categories we use to represent religious diversity. The typology that we're accustomed to is, you could say, the comparative religion model. There are Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus, and sometimes they'll be generous and add Sikhs and Jains and Taoists and maybe Baha'is and Wiccans and pagans and others. To a certain extent, these categories make sense, and one can understand why they became the sort of standard in textbooks and conversation and interfaith gatherings and the like. But they're very limited, and they don't really tell you very much about the actual spiritual lives of the people who come under these categories. For one thing, it downplays the huge differences within these religious categories. When someone says they're a Christian or Hindu or Jew or whatever, what do they really mean other than that they were born into that tradition and or that they adhere to it? People hear my name, for example, even in India, where I go fairly often, and they assume I'm Jewish. And they ask me questions about Jewish theology and rituals and all that. And I try to tell them I'm from Whoopi's side of the Goldberg family, but for some reason, nobody believes me. But in truth, I was raised by anti-religious, atheist, quasi-Marxist parents, and I never saw the inside of a synagogue until I was old enough to be invited to weddings and bar mitzvahs. So my name doesn't really tell you much about my spiritual life, except that my ancestors must have been East European Jews. My point being that the usual groupings, they may tell you which tribe you belong to or a person belongs to, but very little about how they experience and practice their religion or how they approach their spiritual life, or even if they have a spiritual life. And by the differences within the religions, I don't just mean the obvious ones, Catholics and Protestants, Methodists, Presbyterians and Baptists and Episcopalians and so forth, or Sunni and Shia or Sufi, or in Hinduism, Shaivites and Vaishnavites and Advaitins, and the other breakdowns are among Jews, the Orthodox, Conservative, and Reformed. Those are important distinctions, but there are divisions within those divisions. For example, think about the level of engagement a person might have. Those labels don't tell you how deeply involved a person is with a religious institution, or how important it is in their lives, or how devoted they are, or what practices they engage in, how meaningful it is to them. And if you look at it a certain way, somebody of any religion who is orthodox will have a great deal in common with an orthodox person from another religion, and maybe more in common than they would have with their co-religionists who are not orthodox. You could say the same thing about, as we've learned to our horror, about fundamentalists. Fundamentalists of any tradition have a lot in common, and in many ways more in common than they do with the more liberal or independent or progressive people in their own religion. So why not start looking at things through lenses that better reflect the reality of people's spiritual lives? I'm personally drawn to a more sort of functional typology based on people's spiritual orientation or their practices. I find that meaningful because it tells you something more about a person's relationship with the divine than just which religious category they were born into or converted to or whatever. I'm drawn to the 4 classical systems of yoga, which you might think of as Hindu. These categories go back a few thousand years. And what I find useful about them is you will find that they're equivalents in every world tradition. including people who don't identify with any tradition, the spiritual independents and the unaffiliated people that are growing in numbers in every survey of religion. The four, for those who don't know, are, and I'm being very simplistic here, karma yoga, which is often thought of as the path of action, which emphasizes engaging in selfless service, service as an offering to the divine, to do good by others in a way that's unattached and not ego-driven. The second is Gyan Yoga, which is thought of as the path of the mind, emphasizing study and discernment, getting closer to the infinite through the mind and mental practices that eventually transcend the mind itself. And Bhakti Yoga, which worldwide is no doubt the most common, the path of the heart, emphasizing devotion and devotional practices to a form of the divine, a beloved, whichever form the individual or the group might adopt or favor. Path of worship, usually involving practices such, prayerful practices, celebratory singing and chanting. That's the path of Bhakti Yoga, leading to union with the beloved. And finally, Raj Yoga, which is less easy to define, but it's often called the path of meditation, but that's overly simple. It's a path oriented around methods, disciplines, mental and physical ones, principally deep meditation, mindfulness practice. People who emphasize that are typically called Raja Yoga, Raja Yogis. And a few things about these categories. It should be obvious that you find people who might fit those categories, whether they identify with the word yoga or not, is immaterial. But those categories of practice, of orientation, you find that in any spiritual person's life, in any religious grouping, you'll find people who fit those categories. And most spiritual people have elements of all four in their lives. They're not mutually exclusive. One may be dominant over the other three because of the person's personality, the groups they belong to, their orientation. But they usually bring in elements of the other three overall in their lives, and their favored orientation may change at different times in their lives. These are not like sects or denominations. They're categories of spiritual orientation based on what the individual or the group does to facilitate their spiritual aspirations, however they define those aspirations, to cultivate union or communion with the divine in one way or another. So you can say there are Jews and Christians and Muslims whose primary orientation is Bhakti Yoga or Karma Yoga or whatever. And they will have things in common with one another that they don't necessarily share with other members of their own religion who have a different favored orientation. Let me give you an example. Something that happened to me a few years ago, several years ago now, that really drove this home to me. I live in Los Angeles. There's a few blocks stretch in Santa Monica called the 3rd Street Promenade, which is closed for traffic, and shops and restaurants and movie theaters, alongside it, the streets. And on weekend evenings, especially during the summer, it can be very crowded and very fun place to be. There's often a lot of street performers and people coming and going in this very diverse city. And one night I was walking there and a group of Hare Krishnas started, they were chanting and dancing like they usually do if you've seen them in the streets or seen videos of them, especially back in the 60s and 70s. And people were watching, and some people were singing along. It was a very joyful thing. And they were all in orange, the Krishnas. And then all of a sudden, a group of Hasidic men in black hats and black clothing joined them, Hasidic Jews. And they started chanting along with the Sanskrit chants and dancing around in their way. And the Krishnas welcomed them. And it was this fascinating, black and orange tableau. It was like Halloween colors. But then there were other people who joined in, just spectators, people coming by, who knows what, religious or spiritual group they came from, no doubt Christians, maybe Muslims and atheists and Jews and whatever. And before long, it was this big, cross-cultural, trans-religious, ecstatic things. And at a certain point, after one of the Sanskrit chants ended, the Hasids started chanting in Hebrew, and the Christians joined them, and everybody did the best they could to, join along and sing this with them. And, I remember watching this and thinking, well, if there were a gospel group here, they would join in and they'd be at home. And if there were whirling dervishes here, they could join in and they'd be at home. They were all bhaktas, which is what, the Sanskrit word for people who practice bhakti yoga. And I thought, in that moment, they were all bhaktas, and they had more in common. Those Hasids had more in common with the Hare Krishnas, even though they had totally different belief systems, different dogmas, different perspective on history and the proper life to lead. They would have more, as much, if not more, in common than the Hasids do with Reform Jews or conservative Jews, certainly more than atheist Jews like my parents. And the Krishnas may have had more in common with the Hasids, and perhaps some of the other people there who were in that at that time frame, bhaktas with them, than they might with the other kinds of Hindus who favor other pathways, or who are less devotional. There's a term in Hinduism, it's a Sanskrit term called Ishta Devata. It means your favorite or your preferred form of divinity. So for the Krishnas, it's Krishna. For other Hindus, it's Shiva. For Christians, it's Jesus, or maybe Mother Mary. For the Hasids and other devotional Jews, it might be Hashem, or the word of God that is never written or pronounced, the unnameable. For Muslim devotees, the Ishta Devata is called Allah. So, and sort of spiritual but not religious type of people, it might be Mother Nature. It might be the universe. That is the aspirational form that they seek to be united with or to be in communion with. This is why I favor, to me, this says more than about a person than just their membership in one of the traditional categories. Not that those categories are meaningless, they're very important, but we can supplement them with other categories that tell you more about people. And you know, just as I saw with the bhaktas, I know so many people in different religions who are dedicated karma yogis. Their principal path is selfless service. They're devoted to helping the unfortunate, or tending to the sick, or to social justice. And they strive to do it without attachment to outcomes, or to fame, or to success, or anything having to do with self-aggrandizement. It's truly selfless service. And in that way, Mother Teresa, a Catholic, has more in common with Gandhi than perhaps with other Catholics who are less service-oriented. And there are jnanis in every tradition, people who immerse themselves in the study of scripture and try to discern the nature of reality and the nature of the divine, and to understand the nature of who they are and what their connection to the cosmic order is in whatever framework they understand it, to distinguish between the eternal and the temporal. And there are Raj Yogis who are method-oriented in every tradition and favoring a contemplative method of their choosing, or method of prayer, or whatever. There's more of those kind of Raja Yogis, method-oriented people in the Judeo-Christian traditions now than there were in the past, because of the growing interest in contemplative practice and the mystical branches of the traditions that have evolved in the last few decades, in large part because of our access to the Eastern traditions, which served as a catalyst for this. And it should be, understood that there are divisions within these four yogic pathways, and they all contain a variety of principles and practices and orientations, but they add nuance and texture to our usual way of categorizing people and religions. And it's a different way to frame our conversations and our observations about the spiritual life that may reflect people's actual approach to spirituality more than their religious identities. And I would hope that if this or some similar kind of typology were to find its way into textbooks and interfaith gatherings and media coverage of religion, it would help all of us begin or take another step toward rising above or transcending the labels that have created so much tension and conflict in the world, and arguments over who has greater access to the truth and whose belief system, whose dogma, whose doctrine, whose view of history, whose theology is superior or the ultimate. This kind of exclusivity, tribal exclusivity, starts to break down when you look at people's actual spiritual lives instead of their membership. And it would also be reflective of trends over the last 30, 40 years, which clearly show in the research a shift away from belief-centered religion to more of an experiential spirituality, a shift from what these researchers call nesting, that is, identifying with the entity or the institution or tradition you're a member of, and more toward a questing orientation, from nesting to questing, which emphasizes individual exploration and seeking over membership. That's why the last survey I saw from the Pew organization showed, I think it was 27% of people identify with none of the above, the so-called nones, the unaffiliated, the spiritual but not religious being part of them. That's a lot of people. And in people between the ages of 18 and 29, it gets up to about 35%. People are less oriented toward not just the religious grouping they're born into, but of those categories entirely in this diverse and pluralistic world. They want to explore in a pragmatic way and see what works for them. And when you speak about inner experience and spiritual practice, you find you are now in a domain where unity and harmony is found more than conflict and tension. On the great scholar of religion, Huston Smith, who passed a few years ago, and who I'm honored to say, Jessica mentioned one of my books is American Veda, which traces the 200-year history of Eastern traditions or Hindu-derived traditions coming to the West and the impact they've had. Huston wrote the introduction to that. I was honored. And in it, he talks about the difference between the exoteric, exoteric aspect of religion and the esoteric aspect of religion. Exoteric meaning external, the dogmas, the belief systems, the outer activities that characterize different religions, and the esoteric being the individual, the internal, the way the religion is experienced, and the practices one engages in. On the exoteric level, you find difference. We believe this, you believe that. That could be interesting to some people and enriching to some people, and it could also give rise to conflict, as it always has. On the esoteric level, it's, I feel this, I experience this, I engage in these practices. Here's an experiment you might want to try. This was introduced to me. I'd love to say I invented it, but I didn't. But it was introduced to me 15 or 20 years ago in groupings of situations I was in, where diverse people came together. If you are with people from a diverse range of spiritual traditions, do it in small groups, it's easier. Ask each person to remember and describe their most memorable and deep and profound spiritual experiences. With this caveat, they can't use religious jargon when they describe it. Only ordinary language. So no using God, no using Allah, no using Brahman, no using Jesus, none of the jargon from the religious traditions. Just, what did you experience? What was it like? When you do that, it's remarkable. You find across the traditions, regardless of their affiliations and their backgrounds and even their belief system, you'll hear phrases like, I felt profound inner peace. I felt unconditional love. I felt a vastness. My consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of my body. I felt at one with everything. I was connected to all that is, or to the people who were there. The boundaries of separation dissolved. And from what I'm told of the research on the use of hallucinogenic or psychoactive drugs like LSD and psilocybin that are being conducted in research settings, you get similar reports, regardless of the person's religious life and orientation. Secular people, and I know a great many artists who are in this category, they're not very religious at all. They think of themselves as secular. I know scientists in this category. But when you ask them about these kind of experiences, they'll describe the same thing, from being out in nature or being absorbed in their art or being in love with somebody or just spontaneous experiences. Not just the ones that come in houses of worship or during practices. This is terribly meaningful if you think about it, that on the experiential level, and also on the level of how people practice, like the Hasids and the Krishnas, you find harmony. You find the barriers break down. And I think that it's terribly important that we continue to break down those barriers. Otherwise, living in a pluralistic society becomes difficult. Now, there may be other or better categories than the 4 yogas that I suggest. And I suspect that there are a number of ways of categorizing these things that would do just as well. But I also suspect that no set of categories can really do the job, because one thing I've learned over the years, that when it comes to matters of the spirit, there's a certain unpredictability and a certain ineffability. The old saying from the Zen Buddhist tradition comes to mind in the spiritual life, that things are not what they appear to be, nor are they otherwise. Think about that for a while. Things are not what they appear to be, nor are they otherwise. One of the great figures in Indian history, Swami Vivekananda, who is often associated with the interfaith movement because of the Parliament of Religions in 1893, where he gave memorable speeches. He once said that he hoped that religions would continue to multiply until everyone had a religion of their own. And then there wouldn't be so much conflict. But when I first heard that, I thought, oh, that's great. And then I realized it's always been that way, but we don't pay attention to it. We all are on our own paths. We all, in a sense, have a religion of our own. You can go to church or synagogue or temple and assume that the persons next to you are on the same path, but you're not. You'll have different levels of dedication. You'll favor different practices. You'll have different degrees of conviction. You'll entertain different doubts, because everybody's a unique individual. And the more we honor that uniqueness of the actual life of the spirit, I think the more, not only will we have a more accurate view of what religion is and what spirituality can be, but in this age of spiritual freedom and independence, we will also be encouraging greater depth and greater harmony among people. When I was ordained as an interfaith minister, which is now almost 20 years ago, I joked that I said, do I have to call myself an interfaith minister? I want to be a transfaith minister. And to this day, I would like to see us move from interfaith, which has a kind of flat connotation, to a transfaith world, where we transcend the labels and the categories that keep us divided and tied to the past, and yet include those categories. We don't want to lose them. We don't want to say they're meaningless. They matter. But so does the inner experience of this life of the spirit within and beyond those categories. That's my soapbox for the day. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to voice that to people who haven't heard me do it before. And I hope you will take it to heart and at least entertain, the main points that I was trying to make. and see how they jibe with your own thinking and your own experience. And tell me why I'm wrong, or tell me why it had some resonance in your own life and why it may be useful. And while before we open it up, I want to take this opportunity to invite you to my own podcast, which I co-host with an old friend of mine called Spirit Matters. We've been at it for about 5 years now, and it was only audio until several months ago when we snapped out of it and graduated to Zoom. And so the last batch of interviews, we have about 250 or more interviews with spiritual leaders, teachers, scholars, clerics, many of whom are very well known and famous, many of whom are unknown but have a lot to offer. And I have no qualms about promoting it here because it's free. So I certainly wouldn't promote my books because they're not free. But I can encourage you to participate. And I think, the more, that podcast grows and the kind of people we've had on, it's an interfaith education or transfaith education of its own, just going through our archives and listening at, to the people who appeal to you. You'll find it very enriching. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jessica to see how she wants to handle our remaining time.
Sure. Thank you. And you may not promote your books, but I will. And I mentioned them at the beginning, but also wanted to mention that Philip has a website. It's philipgoldberg.com, and that's PILIP.
No. You left out the H.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, PHILIPGOLDBERG.com. Philip Goldberg. So Philip with one L and Goldberg with an E at the end, or not at the end.
No.
Berg.
Berg,
B-E-R-G.
B-E-R, like Whoopi.
Yeah, it's like Whoopi.
And I will say, if you're curious and you go to my website, I hope on Saturday it'll be brand new. We've been redesigning it. So some of the information on the current site is a little obsolete, like the dates of my next India tour, which say February, but we changed it to next October because of the pandemic. But I invite you to come and sign up for my mailing list. I'd love to stay in touch with you.
Sure. I love the categories that you present, of being familiar with them from the yoga tradition. I hadn't really thought of overlaying that on other traditions to see if those categories kind of line up, and it makes so much sense. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And does anyone have any questions you would like to ask? Patrick?
Hi, good evening. Philip, I want to begin just by saying thank you for such a lovely presentation this evening. I am a retired professor of theology and philosophy, and a lot of what you said resonates with me so well. I happen to be a disciple of Mayor Baba from India.
Yes.
I've been a disciple of Baba for over 50 years.
Don't worry, be happy.
Yes, of course. and I'm also so I have the best.
Wait, Patrick, we lost your sound for a moment. You're also what?
I'm also a Franciscan. Yeah, so I have the best of the East and the West. And I just want to mention that something that's always been very important to me is this sense of dialogue. And I will use the word inter, although I love the idea of trans. That's beautiful. But I think that interfaith, intercultural, interspiritual, as you mentioned, inter-experience dialogue is absolutely essential to our survival. And one thing that you said tonight that really moved me when you described your experience on 3rd Street in Santa Monica, I think that it's important that we really be open to those moments of invitation, whether they are direct or indirect, and look at how we might step into someone else's joy and celebration. And that experience that you described in Santa Monica was just quite beautiful. How lucky and how blessed you were to have been there. So yeah, thank you very much. You did a beautiful job tonight. I'm going to look at your website a little bit later.
Okay, well, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it. And I just want to add or say that speaking of Franciscans, one of the people I was most happy to get on my podcast was Richard Rohr.
Oh, yes.
And Father Richard is a great example of what I was talking about, because
yes,
he has created a very large following of people engaged in contemplative Christian practice that resonates very deeply with Buddhist and Hindu practices from which he himself has learned. And he's an example of somebody who is serving a religious community in a way that's different from the traditional way, in a way that's more in line with a practice-oriented one. And I know a Swami from a Hindu tradition who works with him, and so yeah, the Franciscans have I learned a lot about that branch, and it's also very interesting because the Franciscans they're enfolded in what we've called Catholicism, but they're very different from Jesuits and other Catholics and all that. And so Father Richard Rohr's version of Franciscan Catholicism, I would feel very at home in it. Whereas I wouldn't necessarily feel that way in other, well, you know what I'm saying.
Yes, yes, I do. I worked for the Jesuits for 10 years, and I'm very familiar. And, it's just interesting how different orders within the Catholic Church have different approaches to what we're talking about. And it's not that one is good or one is bad. They're simply different. And and that's where the inter-experience dialogue comes into play. So thank you again.
Sure, thank you.
We do have a question in the chat also. The question is, will religion ever become obsolete?
Well, some people will tell you it already is, and some people will say never, because they're eternal. Personally, because of some of the books I've written, when I'm asked about the future of spirituality and all that, I always say it was hard enough to get the past right. And, I am not in the prognostication business. So I know, there are secularists and Marxists and people, with scientific orientations that have been saying religion's obsolete for hundreds of years, or at least, 50 or 100. And, there's a famous Time magazine cover story from the 60s. Is God dead? And it was about essentially has the secular orientation finally overtaken? Has scientific knowledge and secularism overtaken religion? Is religion on the way out? Well, here we are. And it's it's not, religion's certainly not dead, but religion is changing and religion is evolving. I know a lot of people in the category of unaffiliated and spiritual but not religious. If I had to define myself, it would probably be one of those. And one of the things that they tend to miss or crave is community. Because, being a spiritual independent has great value. At the same time, we need each other. We want community. We want fellow people on the journey. And especially when young people who are spiritually independent get married and have children, they want a spiritual home. And the spiritual independents tend to have makeshift communities. The yoga studio, they hang out with their old friends, they get together. I was part of a spiritual community for years back in the 70s, but it became too constricting for me. And I've been independent ever since, but every once in a while, I wish I had a place to go and a place I call my spiritual home. And I make up for it because I have good friends that, it's an ad hoc sort of community. But that's missing. And the religious traditions do community well. They provide that. And there are other things, rites of passage, commonality, buildings to go to when, in non-pandemic times, pilgrimage places. So there's value, but religions have to evolve and they have to change. And in many ways, they're being forced to because people are voting with their feet. The attendance at mainstream churches and synagogues goes down all the time. And not, obviously pandemic changed, everything, but that was a clear trend, that business of people identifying with and membership orientation as opposed to wanting to spread their wings and explore. And dogma is respected less and less, especially dogma that separates people, the dogma of exclusivity, of superiority and triumphalism. Every generation of people is exposed to more and more diversity, and they reject those formulations of dogma. So religion will change, as it always has changed, and some will change faster, and some will be slow to change and will resist change. And maybe even sort of fight back against change, as we see around us all the time. But it's inevitable. And I hope to live long enough to see even further change. But will they become obsolete? Certain forms of religion will become obsolete, and as they have in the past. Popes don't give out indulgences anymore. Yeah, who else?
Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free.
I see a hand raised.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go right ahead.
Hi. I have a question. So I'm a member of an interfaith group, and we have been redoing our bylaws. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
And we've been redoing our bylaws, and we're trying to be more inclusive of people that don't consider that they have a specific faith or whatever, by trying to somehow define it in the new bylaws as spiritual but not religious, or people with other worldviews. Do you have any particular suggestions?
I've heard that from other sources, and I was involved in what we called a trans-traditional group that was attempting we found that, many people don't choose not to label themselves in the traditional way. So what do you call those people? The scholars who do these religious surveys, like for the Pew organization or Gallup or some of the academic researchers, they came up with terms like spiritual but not religious, and none, N-O-N-E, and unaffiliated. I like unaffiliated. I also like independent. I don't, those are not my terms, but they say something. And I'm delighted to hear that people acknowledge that such people exist and are trying to make room for them. I've gone to interfaith. In fact, I spoke on a panel at an interfaith organizations gathering in Los Angeles, where the subject of spiritual but not religious was, on the table. What are the advantages? What are the pitfalls? What do we call them? Can they have a subgroup of their own? And these are interesting. There's some attention was given not long ago to the fact that Harvard University, they have chaplains from all the different traditions. Well, they have a secular humanist chaplain. And he's been the chaplain for the secular humanists for a long time, giving them some sense of, spirituality and community. And so that's, another possibility, humanist. So, yeah, I'm sure you'll find the right term, or you'll come up with a tentative term and let them come, Wouldn't it be fun if you invited a bunch of those people, those unaffiliated independents, and say, we'd like you to be part of us, and we'd like to call you what you wish to be called. And then they can have a convention and fight over what they should be called. And then you'll have schisms in the people who refuse to be labeled, which would be a kind of inevitable recapitulation of the history of religion. But, good luck with that.
Thank you. We are right at 8 o'clock. So let's wrap things up. And again, if you'd like to find Philip online, it's philipgoldberg.com. And it's Philip with one L, Goldberg, B-E-R-G. And if you are interested in checking out other Interfaith Center programs, we have a library of them on YouTube. So just look for the Interfaith Center at Miami University. And our website is oxfordinterfaithcenter.org. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you again, Philip. It was a wonderful talk. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you and good night.
It was a pleasure.
Good night.